Okay, today we're going to continue with our 7th lecture from the behavioral science course. So far we have covered the topics of ethics and developmental psychology. Today we'll begin a new series of lectures which have to do with different psychological theories. So today we're going to cover psychoanalytic theory, and later on we'll cover behaviorist theory. Those are two very important theories in the history of psychology. When it comes to psychoanalytic theory, lay people who are not all that knowledgeable in psychology or psychiatry, or even maybe some physicians, and also because of media influence, there is a tendency to confuse psychoanalysis with psychiatry and psychology. And there are three different things. As you probably know, psychiatry is a branch of medicine that is mostly concerned with pathological behavior, that is to say, mental disorders. Psychology has some connection with psychiatry. Psychology overall is the study of mind and behavior. Now, that may be normal behavior or that may be pathological behavior. So psychology, unlike psychiatry, is not exclusively concerned with pathologies. They also study normal processes, normal mental processes. And psychoanalysis or psychoanalysts, it's actually a school of thought. So a psychiatrist can be a psychoanalyst, or a psychologist can also be a psychoanalyst, but not necessarily. There are psychiatrists who are not psychoanalysts, and there are psychologists who are not psychoanalysts. So psychoanalysis is not in itself a discipline or a branch of study. It's actually a school of thought, a theory. So we'll cover the basics of that theory and how it's important for physicians. Remember that all of these topics probably will appear in the USMLE. So as soon as we finish our lecture, we'll do some review questions with questions that are similar to the ones that usually appear in USMLE Step 1. So let's begin. Okay, well, psychoanalysis is quite known outside the professional realm. I mean, if you watch a lot of movies, sooner or later you will see that many actors make some cultural references to psychoanalysis. And it's a bit unfortunate that people do not really understand what psychoanalysis is about, but some people make reference to psychoanalysis without really knowing the details of the theory. So if you watch a Woody Allen movie or Analyze This with Robert De Niro and Billy Crystal, although it's a funny movie, sometimes they make a caricature of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy in general. But out of all psychological theories, it's probably the most famous. So how did this theory come about? Well, the founder of psychoanalysis is Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud was an Austrian psychiatrist. He was a physician. He was a doctor. He was originally interested in neuroscience. And of course, there's a very intimate relationship between neuroscience and psychiatry for obvious reasons. The psychological is the biological, so whatever goes on inside your brain ultimately has great influences on your way of thinking and your behavior. So Freud was initially a neuroscientist or a neurologist, and he eventually became interested in psychiatry. He was a disciple of a very famous forerunner of psychology and psychiatry, who was Charcot, a French neurologist, who was interested in what at the time was called hysteric people. Now, we don't use that terminology anymore. Now we would actually call them people who are suffering from somatoform disorders or conversion disorders. Freud lived during Victorian times, towards the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And that's important to know because Victorian times was an epoch during which there was a lot of sexual repression going on. And as we will see later on during this lecture, Freud was, some people would say, obsessed or overly concerned with sexuality. And some of his disciples turned against him, namely Carl Gustav Jung was probably the most famous one. They turned against him because they thought that he dedicated too much attention to sexual issues and he wanted to explain everything in sexual terms. And well, not everything in psychology has to do with sex. Now, some historians say that this may have to do with the fact that he lived in an extremely Puritan society, such as a Victorian society in Europe during the towards the end of the 19th century. So he was originally from Austria, and well, when the Nazis took over Austria, he migrated to London, and he died there. And he was from a Jewish background. And originally, there was a tendency to think that psychoanalysis was a Jewish movement. Now, that's not necessarily so anymore, but that was the perception at first, because both Freud and his disciples, most of his disciples were Jewish. Freud was not a practicing Jew. He was pretty much an atheist, but he was culturally a Jew. I mean, he was very much involved with the Jewish community. Although he didn't take, he didn't have faith in the religious beliefs of Judaism and so on. So he was the founder of psychoanalysis. So what are the basic idea of psychoanalysis? Well, the most important idea in psychoanalysis is that as well as conscious thought and behavior, there is also unconsciousness. So you can think of the mind, and this is a metaphor that Freud used, you can think of the mind as an iceberg. I mean, when you observe other people behaving, when you see the way other people behave and have thoughts, you can see just a little bit of what really goes on in their mind. So you see the tip of the iceberg. But underneath the tip, there is a huge part, as in the iceberg, there's a huge part of the mind that it's not so easy to see at first. So the part that you see is the conscious part, but the part that is under the water, that's the unconscious part. So people do things without realizing that they do them, and people do not have the ability sometimes to control their thoughts, because there are many things that they are not even conscious that they have them. And of course, if you're not conscious that you have certain thoughts or behaviors, then you're not really able to control them. And this has some ethical and philosophical implications when it comes to the issue of free will. I mean, are we responsible for our behaviors and thoughts? If our thoughts and behaviors are unconscious, how can we be responsible for them if we have no way of controlling them? This is an interesting philosophical question, but we're not going to go into this discussion for the time being. We can talk about this some other day. But it is important to know that the main idea here in psychoanalysis is the existence of the unconscious. Now, how do we find out what the unconscious is like? I mean, in the case of an iceberg, okay, we see the tip of the iceberg, but how can we find out what's underneath water? Well, in the case of the iceberg, it's relatively easy. You can swim, or you can go on a submarine and you can see what lies underneath. In the case of mind and behavior, well, Freud argued that there are different ways that the unconscious can come out. And he wrote a very famous book in the year 1900 that was called The Interpretation of Dreams. And Freud argued that in dreams, sometimes we dream strange stuff that apparently doesn't make sense. But Freud said it does make sense if you understand dreams as an expression of the unconscious. So all those thoughts that you are not aware that you have, they come out in your dreams. So when there are psychoanalytic sessions in psychotherapy, the patient, or as it's called in psychology sometimes, the client, tells the therapist about his or her dreams, and the therapist can gather what that patient's unconscious is like by interpreting what's going on in those dreams. So that was, according to Freud, one of the most important ways for the unconscious to come out. Now, that's not the only way it can come out. According to Freud, it can also come out with a technique that he developed that was called word association. So in this technique, the person would lay on the couch and he would be relaxed and he would begin to just say whatever was on his mind. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be something coherent. And actually, Freud deliberately asked the patients just to say whatever was in their mind, not to think about it too much. Just let anything that was on their mind, letting it out. And Freud began to he developed the theory according to which those words that come out of people, the therapist is able to find a pattern. And in that word association, in that pattern that comes out, you can find a reflection of the unconscious. So if a person just begins to spat out words, and in those words, let's say that there's a lot of mention regarding, I don't know, let's suppose some rats or horses, then even if the person does not acknowledge that they may have some fixation with horses because they're afraid of horses or whatever, and I'm using the example of horses because there was a famous patient of Freud that was afraid of horses. So if words related to a horse come out, even if the patient is just not aware of it, that may be a sign that in their unconscious, the idea of the horse is very present. So word association was another technique to get the unconscious out. And another way to get the unconscious out, or to reflect on consciousness, according to Freud, was with the slips of the tongue. Sometimes when we speak, we say things that we don't mean to. So, for instance, if I say, I play the saxophone, this is a classic joke. If instead of saying, I play the saxophone, I say, I play the saxophone. Well, even if I originally meant the musical instrument, psychoanalysts believe that that slip of the tongue may reveal that I may be thinking of sex without me even acknowledging so. So slips of the tongue, or as they were originally called, lapsus linguae, slips of the tongue are another way for the unconscious to come out. And psychoanalysts, especially in the early years of psychoanalysis, paid a lot of attention to this stuff. Now, in this division between conscious and unconscious, Freud also added a third dimension, which was the preconscious. So Freud divided the mind in three great parts: the unconscious, the preconscious, and the conscious. The unconscious mind are the repressed thoughts and feelings which are not available to the conscious mind. So they basically have to do with primary processes, such as primitive drives, hunger, anger, sex, wish fulfillment, and pleasure seeking, etc. I mean, those are things that really drive our behavior, and that we're able to control them, but only to a certain degree, and that we may not be conscious that we really have these thoughts. According to Freud, this was very prominent in young children. I mean, young children, they just act out whatever is on their mind, either conscious or unconsciously, without feeling much restraint, without being controlled. So, it's according to Freud, the unconscious is the part of the mind that is more concerned with behaving more like an animal, with having few controls and having more primitive drives. The preconscious are the memories that, while not immediately available, can be accessed easily. So, for instance, when you go and take the USMLE, they may ask you a question that when you're studying for the USMLE, you may be asked a question in your study guide that you immediately do not have access to that, in the sense that it's not immediately in the top of your head, it's not in your mind, immediately available. But if you do a little effort at remembering, then it will come out. This is the preconscious. So there are memories that they may not be immediately available. I mean, they're not on the top of your head, but they can be relatively easily accessed, with a little effort. And there are different techniques to enhance memory. All those memories that are there that you have, it's like a file that you have to look for it, but if you do an effort, you can eventually find it. Well, that's what the preconscious is like. And then the conscious mind are the thoughts that a person is currently aware of. So it operates in close conjunction with the preconscious mind, but does not have access to the unconscious mind. So this is a part of the mind that's concerned with rationality, logic, delayed gratification, and so on. It's important here to keep in mind the difference between preconscious and unconscious. In the preconscious mind, the thoughts are not available to you immediately, but eventually you can get them. Whereas in the unconscious mind, you don't have access to them, and it's hard for you to figure out and even accept that you have those thoughts. So really, the process of psychoanalytic theory, according to Freud and psychoanalysts, is the process that allows you to go deep into your own unconscious to find out what's really going on there. One of the first slogans that psychoanalysts that used was that they were trying to make conscious the unconscious. And according to them, that's a very therapeutical, that's a good therapeutical approach. I mean, inasmuch, according to psychoanalysis, inasmuch as you learn what's inside your unconscious, inasmuch as you make the unconscious conscious, then you overcome problems and you feel better. Now, along with that division of the mind in preconscious, conscious, and unconscious, Freud also talked about another way that we can divide the mind. And he talked about the id, the ego, and the superego. So let's take a look at those three dimensions of thought and behavior, and to see what Freud and psychoanalysis had to say about this. Well, first of all, the id. According to psychoanalysis, the id is entirely in the unconscious. It is present at birth, and it is made up of instinctive, sexual, and aggressive drives. So if I go walking down the street and I see a girl whose butt I really like, or I like her hair and I want to go and grab her butt, that's the id driving me, you know? I mean, it's an instinctive, sexual, and aggressive drive. And it's controlled by primary process thinking. My primary process thinking is just that I like big butts and I want to hold them because I want to have sexual activity and I want to spread my genes, you know. And if I'm hungry, then I just go in a restaurant and I get a hamburger, and even if I have not paid for it because I'm very hungry and I just want to satisfy my hunger. So, I mean, these are the unconscious and instinctive drives. It's not that I'm really thinking about it, it's just that it's my drive. I just feel like doing it, and that's it. So this is the part of the mind that is concerned with that, right? So this is not influenced by external reality. I mean, it's just how, in whatever way the subject feels. Now, of course, not everybody, we cannot live exclusively by the id. I mean, I cannot just go walking around a college campus and go and grabbing a girl's butt just because I like it, because, I mean, that would be sexual assault, and that would get me in a lot of trouble. So, according to psychoanalysis, a lot of deviant behavior is a result of people with too great an id. That is to say that the id in their mind, the unconscious id, is too large and it's not constrained by other parts of the mind. And we'll take a look at them right now. So as a counterpart to the id, there is the ego. Now the ego is present in all three other parts of the human mind, but it's present in the unconscious, in the preconscious, and in the conscious. Now the ego does not develop immediately at birth. It develops a little bit after birth. I mean, remember that the id develops immediately at birth, and those are the drives. So when a kid, when a newborn baby is looking for the mother's breast, that's an instinctual drive. I mean, the baby doesn't have to learn it. He already knows that in order to be fed, he has to look for the nipple. The ego is a little bit different because this is, to a certain extent, these are learned tendencies that develop after birth. Now, the ego has the mission of controlling the expression of the id to adapt to the requirements of the external world. So if the id tells me, go and grab that girl's butt because it's yummy, it's delicious, and so on, and forgive my language here, but I just want to express the idea of how how instinctual the id is. Well, the ego tells me, look, stop it, don't go so far, because I mean that could be sexual assault, and you'll get in trouble, and you may be put in prison, and that girl has rights. So that's the rational part coming in to stop my drive. The ego enables one to sustain satisfying interpersonal relationships. Of course, I mean, in order to get along with other people, you cannot just do whatever you want out of instinct with your instincts. I mean, your instincts have to be stopped in order to get along with other people. For instance, some of you perhaps with this lecture may be bored right now because maybe the topic doesn't interest you or whatever. Maybe your instinctual drive is just to get up and scream at me, "You're so damn boring." But of course, the ego immediately tells you, "No, don't do it, because that will be very rude on the professor, and you may get a bad grade after this," and so on. And by doing that, the ego enables you to sustain satisfying interpersonal relationships. And it also enables you to maintain a sense of reality about the body and the external world. So the ego tells you, "Look, you're not you're not in a jungle just doing whatever you want. You have to respect rules, because that's what society requires." So that's how you're enabled to maintain a sense of reality about the body and the external world. Okay, and the third part of this tripartite division is the superego. The superego, very much as the ego, is developed in the unconscious, the preconscious, and the conscious. But unlike the ego, it's more concerned with moral values and conscience. So it's not so much about the rational part of doing, "Look, if you do this, this could happen to you. Beware of this." But it's more about guilt, more about saying, "Look, after you do this, you're going to feel bad." So the superego represses the ego the id much more. And sometimes it can be an unconscious repression. So sometimes you may do something, the ego may not stop you from doing it, but after a while you may feel very bad. And this is how guilt works. And guilt is a very important concept in psychoanalysis, because according to psychoanalysts, many pathologies are derived from the superego stepping in because of and producing guilt because of some past behavior that was instigated by the id. So the superego is not only conscious, it can also be unconscious and preconscious. And it's usually developed after 6 years old. Now, from previous lectures, you may have remembered that we said that at around 6 years old, kids begin to develop a moral sense, and a sense of justice, and understanding that other people have rights and they have to respect them. And kids who do not develop this sense, well, they may eventually turn out to have what's called conduct disorder. And if it goes on into adulthood, it may even become antisocial personality disorder. Freud did not speak properly about that, but he did speak about the superego developing at around 6 years old, which is the same time when kids develop a moral sense of right and wrong. So this is very much related to that. And of course, as I was saying, this is when moral values and conscience come out, and the superego then controls the expression of the id. Now here's a picture expressing how the three parts of the unconscious mind would work. For instance, the id would say, "I want it now." And let's say that I'm very hungry, so I need a hamburger now, and I need it immediately. The ego would say, "Well, but look, you can't just go to a restaurant and grab it, because you probably won't get a good burger that way, and the police will come and they will take you away. I need to do a bit of planning to get it. So first I need to work, I need to earn money, and then with that money I can go to the restaurant and I can get the burger, and that way I can satisfy my hunger." And then the superego may come in and they may say, "Well, wait, you can't have it. It's not right. There are too many calories, or it's not nutritious, or maybe some kids in Africa are dying, and you're having too much food here. You should consider them," and so on. Now, the superego doesn't tell you this very much as it does not necessarily tell you this directly in a conscious manner. I mean, you may go and eat it, but after having eaten it, you may feel guilty about it. So at the time you were not conscious, and even if you have guilt about having eaten that burger, that guilt is not necessarily conscious. Maybe you feel bad about something without understanding why, and it may be your superego telling you that you should not have eaten that hamburger. So the superego, very much as the id, is not always a part of consciousness. The only part of real consciousness is the ego. Here's another image of the conscious and the preconscious, and the division of the ego, the id, and the superego. So as we can see, the ego is both preconscious and conscious. I mean, it's the series of thoughts that you are aware that you have them, and also those thoughts that may not be immediately in your mind, but you can access them because you keep memories of them. Whereas the id is entirely in the unconscious realm, and the superego can be conscious, preconscious, and unconscious. Now, those tenets of psychoanalysis have been criticized by a lot of people for a number of reasons, and you will probably not hear a lot of psychiatrists be talking about id, ego, and superego. I mean, they're maybe interesting from a philosophical point of view, and even perhaps from a psychological point of view, but not really from a psychiatric point of view. And physicians, they rarely speak about the ego, the superego, and the id. I mean, if you go to the DSM-5, which remember is the Bible of psychiatry, or at least of American psychiatry, in the DSM-5 there's no mention of the id and the ego and the superego, or none of that stuff. And that's why some people say that psychoanalysis is not really all that relevant today. However, Freud and psychoanalysts also talked about some additional concepts, that those concepts are indeed very relevant in psychiatry. And if you go to the DSM-5, the DSM-5 does talk at length about those concepts. And those concepts are defense mechanisms. Now, Freud talked a lot about defense mechanisms, and this is a very useful tool and concept when it comes to psychiatry for reasons that we'll soon get to. So defense mechanisms are unconscious mental techniques used by the ego to keep conflicts out of the conscious mind. They decrease anxiety, and they can be pathological, immature, neurotic, or immature. Now, so defense mechanisms are when you're feeling stressed because of something. You have a very stressful situation to deal with, and it's difficult for you to face the difficulty of that situation. So usually the way our mind works is that when facing that, the mind develops a mechanism to relieve anxiety when facing that stressful or difficult situation. And in psychoanalytic terms, those are called defense mechanisms. So when we all have stressful situations that are difficult to cope with, and various people have different ways of dealing with these difficult situations. So there are different responses to those difficult situations. Now, those different responses are what's called defense mechanisms, and as I was telling you, they can be either pathological, in the sense that they may even eventually lead to mental disorders. They can be immature in the sense that they resemble more the way children behave. They can be neurotic in the sense that they increase anxiety even more and they're not really constructive. And they can be mature in the sense that, they really help you overcome the difficulty, and they have a greater opportunity for better mental health. So let's take a look at some of the defense mechanisms by using an example. Let's suppose that you are a guy or a girl and you're being cheated on. Now that is a very stressful situation, and universally there are many cultural depictions of how people have bad reactions when they find out that they're being cheated on, or even when they suspect that they're being cheated on and that is not the case. And when we get to schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders, we'll talk about delusions, and one of the most common delusions is a jealousy delusion, the idea that your spouse is cheating on you, even when that's not the case. There is a famous play by Shakespeare, Othello, which tells the story of a man who goes through a mental breakdown because he thinks that his wife is cheating on him, when it's actually not the case. Now, assuming that you are being cheated on, that's a very difficult situation to deal with. So there are various defense mechanisms that come out in order to cope with this situation. So let's take a look at them using this example to understand what the different defense mechanisms are when people go through intense stress or difficult situations. So there are, first of all, the pathological defense mechanisms, and the first one of them is conversion. Later on, when we cover somatoform disorders, we'll cover conversion disorders. And conversion disorder is when people, when the patient turns deaf or blind or numb, he doesn't feel limbs or other parts of the body, because the stress that they have is so great that they eventually come to feel symptoms on their body. And there may be no physiological reason for a person to turn deaf or blind, but if the stress is so strong, that psychology can eventually somatize. So if someone is being cheated on, I mean, if it produces a very acute reaction, that person may develop a conversion defense mechanism that eventually turns them either deaf, blind, or numb. Another pathological defense mechanism is delusional projection. So the person who's being cheated on, he may say something like, well, she married me because she was a CIA agent trying to spy on me. So a delusion is an elaborate belief that has no basis on reality, that is absurd, and that no matter how much people try to convince you otherwise, you will not accept the evidence. So when people feel intense stress out of a situation, they may begin to develop delusions, well, in order to cope with this. So, in order for someone to feel a little bit better after being cheated on, they may develop a delusion, such as saying that, oh, well, she married me because she was a CIA agent trying to spy on me. So, it's not that big of a deal if she cheated on me after all, because she never loved me because she was a CIA agent. I mean, that's a delusion. It's absurd. It's probably not true. And no matter how much people try to persuade you otherwise, you will not accept it. That's one common way of projecting delusions as a defense mechanism. There's also another pathological defense mechanism that's called splitting, and this is related to a disorder that we will not cover here because it's not included in USMLE Step 1, but that it's quite controversial in psychiatry, which is the multiple personality disorder, or dissociative identity personality disorder. And this happens when people have a great stress on them because of some difficult situation. One way of dealing with this is becoming someone else to avoid the harsh reality. So if you are being cheated on, well, maybe you may assume someone else's identity, or you may eventually come to think that you're someone else, so that you do not have to face the stressful consequences of being cheated on. That's called splitting. Another pathological defense mechanism is distortion. So someone may say, well, she wasn't really having sex with my friend. She was just doing a physical exam. She was, I don't know, examining his penis or something like that for medical practice. I mean, you're kidding yourself. It's obviously that she was cheating on you. But, it's so tough for you to handle that you may eventually come to distort the reality. Now, this is different from delusion, because in delusion, you make a whole new elaborate belief without basis on reality. In distortion, it does have a basis on reality, but you are not interpreting correctly so as to cope with the difficult situation. So distortion is another pathological defense mechanism. And of course, they're called pathological because this is not what mentally healthy people do. And these pathological defense mechanisms, they can eventually lead to mental disorders, such as conversion disorder, such as dissociative identity personality disorder, or even to delusional disorders. Okay, let's cover now some other defense mechanisms. Immature mechanisms. Now, these are not necessarily pathological, but they are immature in the sense that people who present these defense mechanisms, they wind up behaving more like little kids whose development is not fully achieved. So, in the face of a difficult situation, a patient may act out. So acting out is seeking destructive behavior or seeking behaving mischievously as a reaction to an uncomfortable situation. So for instance, if I'm cheated on, well, I could begin drinking. So I abuse alcohol to overcome the pain. Now that's acting out, because drinking a lot and abusing alcohol will not do any good to me. It has potentially harmful consequences. But I think that's a way of coping with this stress. So it's a very mature defense mechanism because it will not lead to good things, but that's one way of trying to overcome the stress that I have on me. Another immature defense mechanism is fantasy. So, for instance, I could say, oh, in Dungeons and Dragons, the famous role-playing game, I am not cheated on, so it's okay. In real life, I may be cheated, but when I play a video game, I'm not cheated on. Or I imagine myself to be living in another world where people are not cheated on. Well, that's escaping reality. I mean, that's wishful thinking. That's not coming to terms with the real consequences of the world. It's somewhat related to dissociative disorders, but it's not to the point that it's pathological, because the person understands that it's just a fantasy and that they're role playing in that fantasy. But fantasy can also be immature if they are escape route from something that has to be faced. So fantasy is another immature defense mechanism when dealing with stressful situations. And another immature defense mechanism is introjection. So a person that's being cheated on may say, well, I adapt many of my brother's mannerisms because he has never been cheated on. So introjection is imitating someone else as a way to escape your own personality, because being you is very stressful because of the situation you're dealing with. So this is a very immature. I mean, if you are facing a difficult situation, the mature thing to do is, well, to face up the challenge. An immature way of dealing with this is by introjecting, by adapting someone else's either personality traits or mannerisms or so on, because that person is not going through the difficult situation that you are going through. Projection, another immature defense mechanism. That may be, for instance, I may be saying, oh, my neighbor is being cheated on. Poor guy, what a loser. Now, obviously, you're thinking that about yourself, but you're projecting it on others. So projection is quite common, and it's a very common defense mechanism. So let me give you another example that I encounter a lot as a professor, as a teacher. Sometimes students fail their exams because they did not study enough, and they project it on the professor, saying, oh, it's all the professor's fault because he's such an ignorant, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Well, I mean, if you didn't study and you're facing the stress of not having studied and not getting a good grade, it's very immature for you to project that on other people, especially the professor. But as I was saying, that's a defense mechanism that's quite common, especially in academia. Another immature defense mechanism, it's wishful thinking. And when you think that the reality is so stressful that you may eventually come to think that actually no, reality is different and reality is the way that you want it to be. That's a classical defense mechanism. So in the case of being cheated on, the subject could say something like, well, it's okay, she'll never cheat on me again. No, don't lie to yourself, man. Don't kid yourself. If she cheated you once, she's probably going to cheat you again. Wishful thinking is quite immature in this regard. But again, it's a very, very common defense mechanism. I mean, it's not wanting to face the stressful realities that sometimes we encounter, and one way of doing it is saying, well, it's not so bad. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. I mean, sometimes there are bad things in the world. And another one is idealization. Someone can say, for instance, someone that has been cheated on, they can say, well, Donald Trump is a great politician because his wives were always loyal to him. In this case, you idealize someone that should not really be idealized or that should not be idolized for other reasons. And you idealize that person because that person is not going through the stress that you are going through. So in as much as Donald Trump has never been cheated on, then you come to idealize him, not because of his political positions or because he has a lot of money, but because he is not going through the difficult times that you're going and that you're being stressed on. Okay, there are also neurotic defense mechanisms. So there is displacement. If you're being cheated on, then I'm so frustrated. I come home and I kick the dog because I dare not confront my wife with the fact that she's cheating me. So you displace the object of your stress towards third parties, towards people or objects that have nothing to do with that. There is also hypochondriasis. This used to be a disorder in the DSM-4. Now in the DSM-5, it's called illness anxiety disorder. But it's not most of the time, but many times it can also be a defense mechanism. So when people feel stressed by a situation, they may begin to think that they are sick and that sickness has some relation to the difficult situation they're dealing with. So in the case of someone that's being cheated on, they may begin to think, oh my goodness, do I have AIDS? Has my wife spread the disease to me? Has she caught the HIV? And uh, maybe she had sexual relationships with me after she did with that man, and now I have AIDS. Well, I mean, that's worrying too much about something that you shouldn't concern about right now. But that's one way of dealing with this situation by driving attention away from the central problem and concentrating on something else. Another neurotic defense mechanism is intellectualization. And someone that's being cheated on could say something like, "Well, she cheated on me because monogamy is unnatural in the human species, and capitalism promotes immorality. So it doesn't surprise me that she cheated me." Well, this is a defense mechanism where you are dealing with a very stressful situation, where you try to cope with it by coldly analyzing it from an intellectual point of view. So, with the fact that you're being cheated on, you can begin to spot out numbers on adultery and the basis of monogamy and whether or not monogamy is natural or unnatural, kind of as if you were saying, well, look, I shouldn't be really so hurt by being cheated on because monogamy is a capitalist invention, and for the good of the revolution, I have to accept this, and it's okay. That's intellectualizing. That's an intellectualizing defense mechanism, and it's neurotic because it's not really all that constructive. You know very well that no matter how intellectual you are, being cheated on will hurt. And very similar to intellectualization, there is also rationalization as a defense mechanism. So someone that's being cheated on could say, well, she cheated on me because I did not take care of her. And if I take care of her, then she won't do it again. So, you're trying to make rational terms of the situation. I mean, why did this happen? And you try to provide excuses and answers as to why this happened. And you are trying to rationally assure yourself that this will not happen again. I wouldn't bet on it. There's also reaction formation. Someone being cheated on could say, this is great. I always wanted to live in a hippie commune, so I will be very promiscuous. So reaction formation is when people assume optimistically a difficult situation and they react to it, but it's in a very unrealistic manner. I mean, you could say that this person is very happy that he's being cheated on, but let's not kid ourselves. We know that that's not what's really going on in his or her mind. Now remember that the defense mechanisms are unconscious. So I mean, these people may consciously think this stuff, but Freud said, remember, underneath the water there's a huge iceberg. So underneath these conscious defense, these conscious excuses, they're really unconscious defense mechanisms that reveal how difficult it is for these people to cope with these situations. There's also regression, and regression is in the face of a stressful situation, going back to behavior that's more similar to children's behavior. So in the case of someone who's being cheated on, a form of a regression defense mechanism would be something like, I will tell my mom so she punishes my wife for being such a meanie. So, I mean, this is what 5 or 6 year olds kids typically do. When other people behave bad, they go and accuse them with their parents or with some supervisors or something like that. But of course, in the adult world, I mean, that's not the way it works. But with people that are facing extremely stressful situations, they may go and they may express these defense mechanisms as a way of coping with this. Another defense mechanism, social comparisons. So this is related to idealization. In idealization and in projection, you say, "Oh, poor guy, he's being cheated on," when in fact you are the one who's being cheated on. In idealization, you say, "What a great guy, he has never been cheated on." In social comparisons, you say, "Well, my situation may be terrible, but it's not as terrible because other people also have this situation." So in the case of someone that's being cheated on, a defense mechanism of social comparison can be someone that says something like, "Well, yeah, I was cheated on, but Peter was cheated on by all his wives. I was only cheated by one wife. So I think Peter is worse off than me. So, it's not all that bad being cheated on." But of course, I mean, you may consciously say that, but this is a classic expression of an unconscious defense mechanism that reveals that deep inside you really are suffering. Okay, and let's go over now the mature defense mechanisms. These are mature in the sense that, they require more psychological integrity to develop them, and they are more constructive, and they are the better way to approach them because you will face the painful consequences, but eventually this will make it easier for you to heal. And people with mature defense mechanisms have good prognosis, and they are at a lower risk of developing mental disorder as a consequence of stressful situations. So let's take a look at some of the mature mechanisms. Well, first of all, acceptance. And this is probably the most mature of all. Someone that's being cheated on, if they're mature enough, they will probably say, "Well, look, she cheated on me, and we'll have to work it out either by going to therapy or having better communication. And if it doesn't work out, well, we'll have to get divorced." And that's a very mature defense mechanism. And you should realize here that the most mature defense mechanisms are the ones that are closer to consciousness. So there is very little unconsciousness remaining in this. I mean, you consciously accept it and you work it through. And it hurts, it's painful, but the more you accept it and the more you look at it in the face, the easier eventually it will become to overcome it. Another mature defense mechanism is altruism. So someone that's being cheated on can say something like, "Well, I was cheated on, but I want to make sure that no one is cheated on again, so I'll provide community service in marriage counseling." So when people deal with stressful situations, one mature way of approaching this is, well, by providing good services to other people. And so that's one way of coping with stress. And this is very common in people that have had tragedies in their lives, or that some close relatives have died and so on. One mature way of dealing with this is by engaging in community service. And this is very helpful from a mental health approach. Also, anticipation, another mature defense mechanism. Someone that gets cheated, he could say, "If I ever get married again, well, I'll make sure that I spend more time trying to get to know my girlfriend better and building a strong relationship." So, it's anticipation. It's learning from previous stressful experiences so that in the future, these experiences, if they come out again, you may be able to cope better with them. And another mature defense mechanism, emotional self-sufficiency. So someone who has been cheated on could say something like, "I don't care if people laugh at me because I was cuckolded." This is serious stuff. So, in the face of difficult situations, someone could eventually come to understand that you don't really need anyone else's approval or emotional approval in order to cope with that situation. You can work it out on your own. Let's take a look at another mature defense mechanism, forgiveness. Someone that was cheated on could say something like, "My wife hurt me by cheating, but we can work it out, and soon it will be in the past." This is something very mature. To forgive is not easy. To forgive requires a lot of maturity, but from a mental health point of view, it's very constructive. So people who let go of resentment and people who heal, but healing also needs, I mean, you can forgive, but not necessarily forget. So it's not like putting this in the past and never thinking about it again. No, a mature way of dealing with this is thinking about it, but letting resentment go and eventually forgiving. Uh, Gratitude, another mature defense mechanism. Well, the cheated person could say something like, you know what, John was a true friend when he showed me the video of my wife cheating. So this is a common defense mechanism that people have when they feel stressful situations. They become grateful to the favors that other people have done. Now, of course, gratitude can become problematic if you're grateful to the people that are abusing you. But if you're grateful to the people that really help you in difficult situations, then that's a very constructive way of dealing with stressful situations. And also humor. I mean, it's good not to take yourself too seriously. From a mental health perspective, humor is a great resource. So if you don't take yourself too seriously and you're able to joke about yourself, then that's a good way of coping with difficult situations. So someone that has been cheated on, a mature way of responding to this would be someone that said, well, cuckolded guys grow horns, so I hope I don't resemble Rudolph the reindeer after having been cheated on. So laughing at yourself and not taking yourself too seriously can be a constructive way of coping with difficult situations. Okay, more defense mechanisms. Mercy. These are mature defense mechanisms. So someone that's being cheated on could say, my employee was also cheated on. Now I understand why he underperformed last week. So I'll be nice to him. So developing more empathy that have gone through the same difficult situations as you have, it's another defense, mature defense mechanism. Sublimation. Sublimation is doing productive stuff in order to cope with the difficult situation you're going with. So for instance, I could join a football team, or I could teach an additional course to forget or to get distracted a little bit from all this stress that I'm going through and overcome this difficult situation. And suppression. Someone that's being cheated on could say, well, I won't watch Seinfeld anymore because I used to watch it with her and I don't want to think about her anymore. So if this is abuse, it may be this avoidance behavior could become problematic, and it could eventually develop or turn into some mental disorders that we'll cover later on. But for the most part, suppression is a mature mechanism because, if something is really painful, you are aware that it is painful, but you try to avoid those things or situations that remind you too much of it. And, from an emotional and from a mental health perspective, that's not necessarily bad. It could be a good approach too. Okay, and let's talk our last point, another important topic in psychoanalysis that is of concern for physicians. It's transference reactions. Now, transference reactions are unconscious mental attitudes based on important past relationships. So depending on how you related to other people in the past, you may relate to other people now, whether consciously or unconsciously. So there may be emotional reactions that they may influence the relationship between doctors and patients. And this is what Freud and psychoanalysts call transference, and it's very relevant in the doctor-patient relationship. So there is what's called positive transference, and that's when the patient may over-idealize the doctor or develop sexual feelings toward the doctor because the doctor reminds the patient of someone with whom they were in love in the past, or with whom, or someone they idealized in the past. So that's called a positive transference. A negative transference is the opposite. It's when the patient may become resentful or angry towards the doctor because the doctor reminds the patient unconsciously of someone that was abusive in the previous life, during the previous time with the patient. So let's say that a patient comes in and he has had an abusive father, and the doctor has some resemblance, not necessarily physical. It can also be resemblance in personality or the gestures, or also if the patient's father was also a doctor, then that doctor, just because they are both doctors, may eventually come to resemble the patient's father in the patient's mind. Now, if the patient had negative feelings towards her father, then the patient may transfer those negative feelings towards the doctor. So that's called negative transference. And this may be risky in the doctor-patient relationship because it could lead to non-compliance. Remember when we talked about the doctor-patient relationship? An important factor in compliance is how much, unfortunately, it's the way it is, but an important factor is how much the patient likes the doctor. So in transference, this is a big factor. And there is also countertransference, and these are feelings about a patient who reminds the doctor of a close friend or a relative, and this can interfere with the doctor's medical judgment. So transference is not only from the patient to the doctor, it can also be the other way around, from the doctor to the patient. And in a medical setting, this can be problematic because this countertransference may ultimately impair medical judgment. Okay, so that wraps up our lecture for today. Let's do 2 or 3 questions from the USMLE that cover some of these topics. So let's begin with the first one. A primary care physician notices that many of her patients use statements like, "I can't stop smoking because I'll gain weight," or "when I'm sick, I only want to eat junk food." Statements like this are produce conflict in the conscious mind. No, not really, because I mean, they're quite conscious of what they're saying, and it's not like they're stressing what they're saying. Are conscious mental techniques? I wouldn't say so. No, they're not conscious mental techniques. I think they're deep in the unconscious. They increase anxiety. I actually think it's the other way around. I mean, it's a way to relieve anxiety. When someone says that they want to stop, when someone says that they can't stop smoking because they'll gain weight, well, that's a very self-serving excuse not to stop smoking. There are examples of the use of defense mechanisms. Yes, I would say that's so. I mean, I can't stop smoking because I'll gain weight. Well, that's a defense mechanism when it comes to the stressful situation of having to give up smoking and maybe having some nicotine addiction. So because that's a difficult situation, there is a higher probability of developing an unconscious defense mechanism, and in this case it's making up an excuse. And decrease the patient's self-esteem? No, not necessarily. I mean, just saying that you can't stop smoking because you'll gain weight, that doesn't necessarily imply that the patient has a lower self-esteem. So I would say here the answer is D. They are examples of the use of defense mechanisms. Okay, and let's take a look at another question from the USMLE. A patient whose father was often late for important family events storms out of the office when told that the doctor will be late because of an emergency. So this patient's behavior is most likely to be the result of A, positive transference, B, negative transference, C, countertransference, D, dislike of the doctor, or E, anger at the doctor. Well, it may be the dislike of the doctor and it may also be the anger at the doctor, but really what lays underneath that dislike or anger is negative transference. I mean, the patient's father was always late for important family events. That created was an uncomfortable situation for the patient. It created some stress. So whenever a patient comes in and the doctor has some circumstantial behavior that reminds the patient of the way her father behaved and that caused her a stress, then the patient may become upset with the doctor and may transfer on the doctor her negative feelings towards her father. So that would be a negative transference. And of course, the danger of this negative transference is a decreased compliance. So the doctor has to deal with this.